I recall this evening as if it were yesterday, despite the fact that I am now 26 and I was 12 when it occurred. My folks left me and my 18-year-old at home, Zach, my brother, for the evening. Additionally, as initially, I was thrilled as it was simply I was in the large home, which felt like enormous freedom at the moment. Zach informed me he was heading out for a couple of hours with pals and forced me to swear not to tell Mom and Dad, which I consented to because I trusted him. And why wouldn't I want the area to myself? He would enter enormous trouble if my folks discovered out, and he was aware of that. Initially, I believed that being by myself would be enjoyable, particularly on a weekend. At night, after arriving in the den, I chose to watching a terrifying movie by myself at home at that age. I discovered the hard way that this was not the best idea. I had never spent this much time by myself at home, particularly at night, and to be honest, I became frightened halfway through the film, not solely due to the film itself, but rather due to the way the home made a noise. The sporadic creaks in the floor, the sound of the refrigerator clicking on, and the wind blowing against the windows on a regular basis. Each time there was a loud sound in the film, I would recoil and glance behind the couch to the halfway point, expecting to see someone at the top of the steps leading to the main floor. I eventually lost my patience, and I had no idea why I was putting myself through this, myself to frightening me to death. Like a scared young girl, I turned off the TV and hurried upstairs to my bed, child fleeing from phantom monsters who pursue them as soon as they switch off the lights. Upon arriving at my room, I went into the bathroom that linked my parents' bedroom and my room, where I attempted to relax and wash my teeth as quickly as I could. I then went to my room to play Call of Duty. I thought playing zombies on my Xbox 360 would help me feel less afraid. I spent several hours playing, lost count of time, and concentrating on the game. My squad and I ultimately perished on zombies, and I became irritated. I made a decision, but I should go to bed because it was getting late. Shortly afterward, I sensed the front door vibrating, close, and I thought Zach was returning. I was awake, listening to my brother's movements downstairs, which was strange because often, when he would head straight upstairs to his room as soon as he got home. However, strange noises were coming from downstairs for an extended period of time, began to become strange. They were faint, little footfall or unimaginable thuds and thumps. I experienced my stomach began to turn a little, that I was feeling pretty upset about the dumb decision to watch that terrible movie. I stood up and looked out the window, anticipating Zach's vehicle in the driveway where he typically parked, but it wasn't present. At that point, the actual panic set in. At the time, I didn't have a cell phone. Since I was only 12, I was unable to speak with Zach or my parents without moving from the bedroom to one of the home phones, which seemed unfeasible right then. I stealthily approached the door of my bedroom to verify that it was locked, being aware that it is possible to unlock the lock from only a fingernail on the opposite side. I understood that, if someone wanted to enter, they could do so with ease. I glanced around and determined that the only secure location to hide Waste's tiny crawling closet integrated into my room's wall. Squeezing inside, I closed the door cautiously from the inside, and as I listened, I attempted to relax. It was at this moment that I clearly recall wishing that I was merely being excessively suspicious, and that it was Zach. Perhaps he parked on the side of the house as an alternative. After a few seconds, I heard someone struggling with the door in an attempt to enter. The door opened a few moments later. The individual was in my room, and I had no idea what they wanted or who it was. I remained motionless, listening to walking around my room. I felt the weight causes the flooring to creak, of a person hearing things while walking being shifted and relocated. Each and every second seemed to go on forever. I was fearful that the wardrobe door might open at any moment, and I might not survive. I continued to hope it was my brother, but I remained silent, hardly breathing, and wishing the person would go. They were dragging something, as I could hear, at one point, across the floor. This increased my anxiety. I experienced as if hours had gone by, although it was most likely just a few minutes. After a while, I heard footsteps getting farther away from my room. I remained in the closet for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 2 hours, before I eventually heard Zach shouting my name from the other side of the house. His tone was angry and urgent, and after a short while, he called my name once again in the chamber. I took a step, emerged from the closet, and the first thing he asked me what I was and yelled at me, what I had done there, and what I was doing his chamber. This was the time that verified for me that it wasn't my brother who was at home. I gave a brief explanation of the circumstances, as still trembling, I could not prevent my hands from shaking. After he realized, we both rose up and began exploring the house together. That's when we became aware of how awful it truly was. They had taken out drawers. A few of our devices were absent, including game systems and televisions. It was obvious that someone had experienced the home and had removed items that were worthwhile. Zach made a quick call to the cops, realizing how serious this was, as we waited together, still tense, examining windows and doors to ensure nothing else was seized. The police arrived and prepared a report, noting anything that was lacking and inquiring us inquiries regarding what transpired. They assured us they would look at it and that we ought to hold off till our folks get at home. Around 4 o'clock a.m., our folks showed up. Enraged, my father headed straight for Zach, giving him a hard blow to the face for being such a reckless fool. Not only abandoning me, but departing to the front door is unlocked. My mother inquired about me, embraced me, and informed me that I was so relieved to be safe. Zach had to pay the rent each month after that to gradually repay all of the things that were taken and subjected to severe to that night. Exercise caution. I, on the other hand, received no punishment. I was simply shaken, afraid of what had taken place, and the entire encounter remained with me for many years. Whenever I considered it, I could experience the dread once more, recalling the closet's hiding place, and I heard someone moving around my room. I wasn't sure if I would survive alive. It was the scariest of all encounter of my life, and it has remained with me to this day. Not even in kindergarten, when I was a little child, I lived with my grandparents. My dad worked in the nearby town, and my parents had recently divorced, so every weekend I saw him. Since my dad's brother, my uncle, also resided with us, I was rarely really by themselves. I was constantly advised not to let outsiders in. Everyone in the little, quiet community knew one another. Our neighbor frequently came over to watch hockey, wrestling, or participate in family cookouts. I'll refer to him as David. He was cordial with both of my uncle and my grandfather. He frequently joined my uncle for beer and assisted my grandfather doing truck repairs or garden maintenance. When my grandfather returned from hunting with a moose, he and David would carry it home. Together, they went into the shed. I was momentarily left alone at home one evening. I had called for a pickup when my grandmother was at bingo. My own grandpa asked if I wanted to accompany him when he said he was going to get her. I declined due to the cartoons I was viewing. I was reminded by him not to open the door for strangers. After that, he departed. As soon as the home was silent as the truck pulled away. After just a few minutes, someone rapped on the door. I heard David's well-known voice as I hurried over and inquired out loud who it was. Recognizing himself, when I informed him that my grandparents were not at home, he responded that he had just witnessed my grandfather's departure. I informed him that my uncle wasn't at home, and he claimed to have known my uncle was out drinking at a friend's house after speaking with him on the phone. Then he requested to enter. I informed him that I wasn't permitted to unlock the door for strangers, but he maintained that since he was our neighbor and someone I already aware, he was correct in my young mind. However, I didn't see why he would visit when my uncle and grandfather weren't around. I opened the door after unlocking it. David was much taller than me. He was clearly intoxicated, slurring, wobbling, and narrowing one eye. He entered and placed his hands on my shoulders while I retreated. I hadn't yet become concerned because I had seen my uncle was frequently intoxicated. He could wait in the kitchen while I went, I informed him. He refused to let grip of my shoulders as I went back to watch TV. I attempted to pull his hands away from me, but was unable to. Anger filled his voice, and he said things that made me feel afraid, even though I can't recall the precise words at the moment. He pulled me into the kitchen and picked up a big knife. He inquired if I wanted to be stabbed while pressing the point to my stomach. He threatened to slit my throat or tongue if I didn't stop crying. To demonstrate his seriousness, he ran the dull side of the blade across my throat. Then I heard the arrival of my grandparents' truck. Automobile doors closed on the outside. I was ready to yell for assistance as relief overcame me, but David clasped his cover my lips with my hand. Just as my grandmother was turning us both towards the doorway, he came in. When she realized that he was holding me with a knife, her smile disappeared. She cried out for my grandfather to enter right away. My grandfather stormed in, demanding to know what was going on, and yelling with shock and rage. After glancing at David keeping me captive, he lunged forward and yelled at David with utter fury. David pushed me to the ground. Grandma came running over and grabbed me, firmly, assuring me that I was safe, but preventing me from seeing what was going on. The struggle was still audible to me. My grandfather eventually got the better of him. When I eventually raised my head, my grandfather was slamming the door, pushing David out the door and screaming at him to never return. Growing up, I came to understand that David had purposefully waited. He had to have knew that my grandmother was playing bingo and that my uncle wasn't at home. He had observed my grandpa departed. It was his time. I was too young to comprehend his motivations. After my grandfather's funeral, years later, I mentioned that evening and how brave Grandpa had been. While I was sitting with my grandmother talking about memories, she appeared uncomfortable. It was a really scary night, she claimed. She inquired as to whether I recalled my grandfather going hunting that evening. Even though he didn't hunt at night, I vaguely remembered him leaving. Generally did, unless camping was included. She said she didn't remember much when I inquired why he had left. It made me reflect. They never reported him to the police, and after that night, I never saw him again. My own grandpa was well liked in the neighborhood. He attended the same church as some police officers and was friends with them, and had a reputation for being a skilled hunter. Nobody would ever wonder if they witnessed that he was leaving town late at night with a bloody tarp in the back of his vehicle. When I was 15 years old, this story took place over spring vacation in 2020. One evening when my parents were out of town, I was at home by myself. I was chilling out in my room when Mason, one of my mutual school buddies, called. I answered even though I don't typically receive calls or texts from Mason, let alone stay in touch with him. He asked me what I was doing before I could say anything. I informed him that I was simply at home and had nothing planned. Then he inquired he needed us somewhere to spend the night, so I asked if he could drop off one of my friends. I'll call this friend of mine Neil. I've known him since 3rd grade. I essentially told him that I simply wanted to relax by myself and didn't feel like having company around. Mason actually pleaded with me to let Neil stay at my house after learning this. He begged me to let him drop Neil, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. At first, I was still hesitant, but Mason assured me that I could utilize his marijuana pen if I allow him to deliver Neil. I gave in and told him they could pull up after he said that. In retrospect, I saw how foolish it was of me to let something like that to convince me, given what took place after that. But at the time, I was a foolish Ted. What can you do then? Neil has always been incredibly gregarious. Almost he has no filter and doesn't give a damn about what people think of him. Thus, when the previous week, I learnt from my brother and other friends that he had begun acting strangely in his classes. Didn't give it much thought at first. When I urged my brother to provide further details, he revealed to me that Neil would occasionally burst out laughing or clapping. Even when the classroom was entirely, he was quiet and occasionally said bizarre things to people without any justification. such as saying that the basketball coaches were attempting to convert him as Freemasons. I became aware that Neil wasn't behaving normally after hearing this, and I didn't realize how terrible it was until he and Mason got to my place. Like every other day, I greeted Mason and Neil when I saw them at my front door. I returned Mason's cannabis pen after hitting it as promised. Mason was going to with tears welling up in his eyes. He firmly grasped Neil by the shoulders and begged him not to take that action. Neil gave him a blank stare and nonchalantly replied that he comprehended. I should have inquired about what was happening, but for some reason I didn't. And as Mason departed, I allowed Neil inside. Neil asked me if every door in the house was locked as soon as I shut the front door. I knew I had just gotten into something dangerous as soon as red flags went out in my thoughts. I informed him that they were locked and inquired as to why. He requested that I escorted him along the little hallway by the front entrance to demonstrate that the doors to the laundry room and back were both secured. After I verified it, he remained silent, and we stood in a brief period of silence. Then, suddenly, his hand appeared as though he raised it, and I can still clearly picture the weird, toothy smile he put on. Without uttering a word, he lowered his arm after holding it for a few seconds. To make the scenario appear less strange, I pretended to laugh. Neil then requested some water, so we headed to the kitchen. I saw him as I took bottles out of the refrigerator, hovering near the drawer containing the knives and other cutlery. I observed as I reached for a steak knife to carefully opening the drawer. Without pondering, I hurried over, snatched his hand before he could accept it, and forcefully closed the drawer. Neil remained motionless and unresponsive. He simply gazed at me and laughed like he was acting, as though it were a joke. I could feel my heart racing at that precise moment in my ears, and I was paralyzed with terror, the type of terror people express when faced with a life-threatening circumstance. Until then, I had never felt like my life was in jeopardy, and all I could think about was how I was going to get Neil. Please leave my home. At last, he broke the silence by proposing that we visit the park in the area. As if nothing had happened, I agreed. I purposefully let him out first as we made our way to the laundry room that led to the driveway. I told him I had to put on shoes, and I did. He told me to hurry up after pausing and giving me a mildly disappointed expression. I called my brother to let him know what had happened, closed the door, and secured it right away. I picked up every knife in the kitchen once the call ended and carried them upstairs to my space. Remember, I was high at the time, so my choices weren't ideal, but I was aware that I had to stop Neil from breaking into the house again. My brother and 3 pals showed up and they met Neil in less than 5 minutes. Outside. I spent a few minutes inside, anxious, then left. My sibling and Neil was conversing with buddies who were babbling about the basketball team, school coaches' membership and the Illuminati, and asserting that they would abuse the lads in the squad to force them to participate improved. He spoke incoherently for a few more minutes. We then made the decision to get him home, as I couldn't possibly be allowing him to remain in my home after what had taken place. Neil was eventually taken by one of my friends home, despite his insistence that he couldn't leave as he trusted his father was going to murder him. Following all of I gave Mason a call to find out what Neil had told him, causing him to act that manner. Mason further clarified that throughout the Neil had been reading a vehicle journey manifesto stating that he had to kill either himself or another person to stop his dad from attempting to murder him. Mason had scared and only wanted to get rid of Neil. This clarifies why he sounded so eager to deliver him to my home earlier. I went crazy after hearing this and questioned Mason about why he would simply ditch Neil at my house without my knowledge. Even so, I realized that I was somewhat to blame for not requesting earlier. Subsequently, it was discovered that Neil had used drugs inappropriately, which caused schizophrenia episodes and made him hear voices. A month or so later, I informed my mother of the narrative, and she wasn't excited. To take it casually. Obviously, I stayed away from something genuinely terrible that evening by feeling tense as Neil walked into the home, and I continue to consider what might have occurred If I hadn't made the payment in the kitchen, pay attention to him. Pay attention to him. When this occurred, I was 10 years old. My mother had gone food shopping day, and she asked whether I would like to attend. I recall making a huge deal out of not wanting to. I really wanted to stay home on this beautiful, sunny afternoon and make baskets in the street. I informed nothing negative would happen to her, and she would only be gone for a few hours. At last, she caved and let me to remain. As soon as she exited, I took the old basketball from the garage and began shooting in the driveway. We had a hoop set up in the street. I spent some time playing small games with myself, acting as though I was defeated by a buzzer shot. I was perspiring a little from sprinting back and forth, and I once paused to catch my breath. I gave the ball a bounce, languidly, taking in the neighborhood while I gathered my breath. I turned to face the home at that point. Someone was looking down at me from the upstairs window. At first, there was only a shadow behind the glass, like there was a person standing away from the sun. After staring for a good 2 seconds, the shape moved a little, and I came to the conclusion that it wasn't a solar trick. There was a person standing at the window, gazing out at the street. My family was not meant to be at home. My sister was a college student. My father was working. My mother was also out of town, purchasing food. I let go of the basketball without intending to. My sister's room had a window. The blinds, the figure was just behind them, and they were only partially open. That's all I saw, which is why I say figure. No distinguishing characteristics. There was nothing else I could do but run. See who was at home by going inside. I sprinted via the garden gate and around the side of the house. I stormed in and slammed the door behind me. Asking who was home, I shouted up the stairs. I shrieked it, and my voice broke. I heard nothing for a moment. Then someone from upstairs responded. "Rad, come upstairs," it said. It wasn't my mother. Neither my dad nor my sister were involved, though not as deep as a voice. It was deeper than any of theirs. A mature man attempting to sound menacing. It seemed to be attempting to sound normal. I stayed away from the steps. I dashed through the house, snatched the home phone off the kitchen counter, and ran as quickly as I could back outside. I informed my mother over the phone that someone was in the house, and initially she didn't think I was telling the truth. That's not something to laugh about. She informed me. She claimed to be nearly finished shopping, but I began essentially sobbing over the phone, assuring her that I wasn't kidding, and that I heard my name was called from within. "And they are at the window upstairs." When I started crying and pleading with her to come home, she finally believed me. She declared that she was about to leave the store. She must have contacted the cops after hanging up, since a police car arrived just as my mother's vehicle entered the driveway. She came running over to ask where I had seen the person. I gestured towards the window upstairs. First to enter were the police. After a minute or two, my mother followed them inside. I stood outside and waited. I was reluctant to return. I just stood there looking out the upper window for 10 minutes. Nobody showed up to it once more. One of the policemen eventually emerged and stated I felt secure enough to enter. I entered. He gestured to the room upstairs, where I noticed the man. They looked into the closets, behind the dresser, beneath the bed. They even looked in the attic. They examined each and every room in the house. They didn't locate anything or anyone. After the police departed, my mother began acting uncertain once more. She expressed her belief, and I could sense she didn't entirely understand me. If she discovered that I was messing, she stated I would be penalized for frightening her and squandering the time of the cops. I retained, assuring her that I was saying the truth. She continued to claiming to be aware, but her voice said something different. That evening, I had difficulty going to sleep. I continued to think regarding the darkness behind and the voice the blinds, but I ultimately became weary, sufficient to fall asleep. I'm not sure what when I woke up, it got dark, and I initially believed I had awakened from a nightmare. But then I heard something in my room that's loud enough to awaken me. I sat up straight in bed. My own eyes were still getting used to the darkness. However, I could make out the general layout of my room. I could see my closet door and dresser opened, my shelves, and all over the room, next to my bed, I noticed something different. A strange form. A towering, shadowy figure standing fully still. For a moment, I believed that I was envisioning it. But then the smallest I realized what it was when it moved. It was an individual, an adult standing in my bedroom. I didn't even give yourself time to breathe. All I did was yell, a terrible, shattered scream that ripped from my throat. When I let out a scream, the figure moved quickly. It scurried over my room into steps, reached for my window, opened it and leapt out. I've heard the man's feet touch the tiny awning beneath the window. My parents suddenly became the room as soon as I let out a cry. My father rushed directly to the window and took a peek. Out. After that, he bolted downstairs and out the back door in an attempt to locate the perpetrator. I'm pretty sure he rushed out there, barefoot. He returned a little while later experiencing DYSPNOEA. He continued to shake his head, claiming to have seen no one. They made another police call, but that most of the time, it was only to file another incident report and for the police to examine the region. We're not sure how long he was inside the home. I only know that he spent enough time indoors during the day to recognize my name, and he was observing me from he remained in my sister's window, home till dusk. That or he entered and exited the house covertly, through the window of my bedroom by ascending on the awning. In any case, he was in my room as I slept, stood there in the shadows. Who knows what more he might have done while he was at home. That's the most terrifying aspect. That's the most terrifying aspect.